For many in Namibia's Ova, Herero and Nama communities, open wounds remain from German colonial and military atrocities in the early 1900s. It's estimated that up to 80% of the Ova Herero and 50% of Namas died in battle, forced starvation, and subsequent enslavement in concentration camps run by German colonialists, in what is widely accepted as the 20th century's first genocide. And that's after the wealth of indigenous communities, mostly estimated in land and livestock, was systematically stripped from them and given or sold cheaply to German settlers. For decades, the Ova, Herero and Nama wars with German colonialists were presented as uprisings from dangerous tribesmen intent on killing settlers that had to be put down. But the reality was quite different.
In the struggle, it wasn't, as you would imagine, a colonial army or a Western army where some organized soldiers would walk off, but it was really very much a community effort. So women were certainly very much involved in it. We do have the historical records that were recorded by the German side, or in some cases in the south, also by the South African side. And these, of course, were 19th, early 20th century, very patriarchal societies who didn't really recognize the value of women. But from the little that we know is that women were certainly involved.
That's anthropologist Heike Becker, who is based in South Africa and has written extensively on the role of Namibian women in the fight against oppression. To reiterate, German soldiers were part of an invading army. And while many historians have argued the concept of land ownership wasn't understood by nomadic Herero or Nama people, these communities certainly knew when they were being invaded.
Women were in the forefront. They played a very active role. And I want to highlight a few. Like in the 1904s or 1900s, women were alongside the men, encouraging them as they were fighting the German soldiers.
That's Esther Mwinyangwe, a Namibian politician and leader of the opposition party NUDO. She is from the Herero community.
There is something that we call Ondoro, where women were saying, "Oh, Novita, it's war. So continue fighting." They were encouraging men in that way. When one reads some of the books, the German soldiers thought that the women were dancing. But in fact, women were not dancing, but they were ululating and encouraging men to continue fighting and not to, motivating them for them not to be discouraged.
Indeed, diaries of German soldiers at the time mentioned the presence of women near or on the battlefield. This struck fear into German soldiers, who saw it as an affront that they could potentially be beaten by Ova Herero warriors and women, and fueled, as former Governor Theodor Leutwan put it, a mad rage. The true carnage of this mad rage only became clear about a decade later, when South African forces replaced the German colonial administration during the First World War. While not exactly sympathetic to the plight of indigenous people, the administrator's report from 1918 inadvertently revealed the horrific extent to which indigenous people, Ova Herero, Nama, Damra, and others, regardless of their involvement in armed conflict, were systematically murdered, tortured, enslaved, and raped. Eyewitness accounts, often from people serving German forces, revealed the callousness and cruelty with which German soldiers persecuted victims after General Lothar von Trotter's infamous extermination order of 1904 for the Ova Herero and a separate order against the Nama in April 1905. This war of extermination beyond the battlefield aimed to destroy communities in which women were vital. For Jefta Ngu-Herimo, author of the book Unburied, Unmarked, which chronicles his own family's survival of German colonialism, women performed extremely crucial functions in traditional society.
The role of women, it has been very strong in that era in terms of making sure that the family keep going. And most of the men were involved in raiding others, or war or skirmishes or whatever it is, or cattle raising, but women bore the brand of being taking care of the community. And in terms of their prominent role, their narrative, Herero tradition that shows, of course, they were very wealthy women, were independent as well. The women knew what was at stake is losing their land and dignity, so they encouraged their men to fight. And so these are also narrated through the Ushina, which is the traditional women clapping. If you listen carefully to those historical songs, they were active participants in the war against the German domination.
He adds that the survival of much of Herero cultural tradition after the genocide is in fact due to women.
Of course, after the genocide, the majority of the people who survived were women. And that's a fact. But then the goal of, after the genocide, the key was to how the Hereros reconstituted themselves as a tribe in terms of their culture, and reconstituted themselves as a force at the time in the political situation in Namibia. So part of that culture was to tell the history of the people. Our history has been narrated. It was oral history, and it still remains oral history. It's not written, but that has been passed on from generation to generation.
It is hard to overstate how cruel the German colonial administration was towards indigenous Herero, Nama, and Damara people after the conflicts ended. Even though racist German laws banned the marriage or cohabitation between Germans and indigenous women, women were routinely raped, abused, and enslaved by settlers or exploited by colonial enterprises. This was especially brutal in the concentration camps, and Shark Island, near the town of Lüderitz today, was one of the worst. Sima Leupert, who is a social development activist and part of the Nama community, describes some of the most horrifying moments.
They were put into concentration camps in order to solve sort of the labor shortage issue that the colony faced at the time, and where they, through these concentration camps, where they were made available to farmers and to private companies as slaves for slave labor. These concentration camps were also used for conducting medical experiments, but also very gruesomely forced to cohabit with soldiers and with railway laborers and also settler farmers. So sexual abuse was very frequent. The scraping of skulls was very frequent.
And it's not like this was somehow hidden. There are surviving postcards and photographs showing German colonialists cheerfully packing the skulls of Nama and Herero victims into boxes to be sent to Germany, allegedly for scientific research.
This period also saw the opening of a number of brothels in Lüderitz, also at Hotel National, at the Central Hotel, at Hotel Fürst Bismarck. These were all hotels that hosted brothels.
Yet there are meaningful stories of resistance by Herero and Nama women who found themselves in unimaginable situations under German rule. After 1907, reports from the time emerged of German administrators and farmers complaining of labor shortages and that fertility rates among local women had decreased significantly. While this has been put down to the severe trauma faced by women and the spread of sexually transmitted diseases due to widespread rape, another theory is that as an act of resistance, women deliberately chose not to bear children, and especially not by white men, as they believed their children would only become slaves to the colonial system. One better-known act of resistance is that of Yahahora Petronella Inavinuthwe, better known as Mama Pene, as written by her grandson Uathuvara Kashivena. In the narrative, Mama Pene's parents were shot dead by German soldiers early in the genocide, leaving the 11-year-old girl to fend for herself, before she eventually found work on a German-owned farm. Historian Becker recounts this anecdote.
She did something really quite amazing. She decided that she did not want to be touched by any German men. And how And certainly she didn't want to have any children with German men, with many of her contemporaries, other young Herero women were having at the time. So in an extraordinary act of courage, she protected herself against rape by Germans. And she did that by using a lot of nettles to make herself look ugly. So she repeatedly burned her body and her face with it in order to prevent her being touched by German men and having to bear German children.
While male Ova Herero and Nama resistance leaders like Hendrik Witbooi, Jacob Marenga, Cornelius Fredericks, and Samuel Maherero have been memorialized in monuments, books, and even banknotes, there is little to remind today's Namibians that women were far from passive during the murderous and repressive colonial regime. But Nama and Ova Herero women did resist in diverse ways, in conflict and in the post-war era. This special feature was brought to you by DW with support from the German Federal Foreign Office. I'm Kai Nebe.